yourself in the chat box, your name, where you're coming from, and your location. And then if you haven't joined before and would like to, announce yourself, feel free to speak up. You have a bit of time to do that while I figure out how to do the recording. Oh, it's already recording. Good. Okay. In that case, I will turn it over to Mark to introduce this workstream.
Great, thanks, Amy. So yeah, next slide, please, if that's okay. So just want to do a recap on Workstream 1, which was undertaken a couple of weeks ago. Just to remind everyone, that one was, we were looking at the workflows for decarbonising energy infrastructure projects that were undertaken by UNDP and GIZ. And as part of that process, we outlined what the key steps for decarbonising energy infrastructure was. Okay. And part of that process, in the breakout discussions on the Thursday, we looked at undertaking a critical review of those workflows. So thank you very much, UNDP and GIZ, for taking that feedback on the chin with the good intention that it was meant in terms of how to strengthen the process. And what we were looking at how do we make these workflows more suitable for PPA and lease agreements, how to improve the uptake of these workflows to other agencies, but also how can we change these to meet industrial best practice. And we concentrate a lot on incorporating energy efficiency around those topics. And last and not least, because GIZ's model is based on sort of development projects, what sort of adaptation is required for the development settings. And as I mentioned, what we will be doing, and apologies this hasn't come out yet, is that for each of these work streams, we'll be doing a short workshop paper, essentially 1 or 2 pages long, just pointing you to the direction of where the materials can be seen for later, but also outlining the sort of recommendations and concrete next steps, which we will work with you through a sort of online survey to identify what people will see as the main priorities going forward. Next slide, Amy, please. And then we come on to Workstream 2, which is about today and Thursday. Here we will be looking at very concrete activity. In Q1 of next year, we would like to have UNDP signed up with long-term agreements with 20 or so energy service companies using the sort of leasing agreements and PPA methodology as a way going forward. And to be able to do that, we need to design and produce a request for a proposal. And we need to do the same for the sort of long-term agreement. So the request for the proposal is essentially putting out what we want into the marketplace and getting an idea back of who is offering what services and at what cost. And then those that are chosen as the best way forward or given sort of a good solutions would then enter into a long-term agreement with UNDP. And to take this back to Workstream 1, where other UN agencies could piggyback the whole workflow process or even just piggyback the procurement process. So accessing those long-term agreements for their own needs at the end. Next slide, please, Amy. So today, this is workshop 2.1. So we intend to increase people's awareness of the RfP and long-term agreement process. We will start to consider what we would like to be involved in the RfP and the LTA going forward. And more importantly, speaking about what makes a good RfP, what are the pitfalls, what will bring good quality proposals to us at a cost-effective manner. Okay. And then on Thursday, what we'll be looking at is what would the ideal process look like, what services are required, and what support is needed to provide by the agency. So here we will be looking at who provides security, who does the importation, what's the role of the vendor, what's the role of the agency. And also, to consider who we want to respond to the RfP and how do we attract those that we want to be part of that process. Okay, Amy? And obviously, considering the next steps as always as part of this process. As we mentioned in the kickoff, what we are looking to do is to engage everyone through these workshops, identify concrete next steps, and pull task forces together to deliver those priority activities. But first, I'd like to hand over to colleague Paul Quigley, who will run through the next few slides. None of this should be new. What we're doing here is just looking at reinforcing the energy solutions we're looking at, what delivery models we're looking at, and why we are picking these to go forward. So this is just a sort of a nice way of just underlining where we're at and where we would like to go. If anyone does have any questions or comments, can you please use the chat function within Zoom, and when we get to the end of the presentation, there will be a couple of minutes there where we'll select a couple of questions to be addressed. So thank you all, and handing over to Paul.
Hello, thanks Mark. Good afternoon, everybody. We've kind of been through some of these things in previous workshops. It's kind of, as Mark said, just to kind of summarize what we're kind of looking at for some of those who haven't been. So we first of all looking at the present solutions. What are we using at the moment, and which is generally a combination of grid and diesel generators to provide electricity to a load, which is an office or an operation of some sort. And then where do we want to go with that? We want to look at what we can do next, which is simple solar PV systems to add to what we have. But then we have adding things like diesel generator, we have battery storage with it. Are we also grid connected? So there's multiple different things here. At present, these are the sort of solutions that are there. In the future, there could be all sorts of other wonderful things. We don't know yet. So in general, we're going to try to make these LTAs, etc., somewhat technology neutral. So we can accept any sort of system, and we can compare and contrast the costs and different advantages of those. And the final part in that is the energy efficiency thing. So we have a particular load. The better we can reduce it, the smaller system we're going to need, the lower the cost of that is going to be overall. So this is just to say we have a demand for electricity, we try to reduce that, and we have lots of different ways of producing that electricity, which we want to be able to include all of those. And as we move into the future, we want it to be as green and cheap as possible, essentially. So next one there, Amy, please. And with those, we do have fixed systems, which are put into place for 20 to 30 years, let's say, and then we have others which are more mobile, and they may suit more flexible or dynamic situations, which could be very applicable in certain businesses as well as in humanitarian settings, which can be dynamic or require different things. So we could analyze both of those. Some tenders we may leave it open, and again, with situations, sometimes things start off very small, and the influx which changes or get much bigger. So it's great to have a scalable system in many cases, and we may need to design our LTAs to provide or allow for that. But we need to add to the system or whatever in the future. So you go ahead again, Amy, thanks. And just looking at the specific delivery model. So what we have mostly at present is an ownership model, where the organization owns and operates the system, which is great when you have in-house technical expertise. If you already have the amount of money that you need, you can go ahead again twice there, Amy, thanks. And it can be the most cost-effective method if you have all the money up front. It usually is, and you've low costs over a while, and then you can depreciate that. Amy, can you click again there? The issue is you need the high upfront money, and you have to have the in-house expertise. You also take total responsibility for the quality and continued good operation of that system. And if you don't have that in-house ability and experience, this is the challenge, and it continues to be a challenge. So the next one, please. And what we're trying to look at is the potential to go to a lease or PPA model. So this one is where you would just lease it. You could lease to own in the end. The difference when you're leasing to own is you still own it. As in the first case, the first delivery model, then you still need to take all that responsibility, and it may suit some of us to just lease it and not to have to take all that responsibility. With this, the idea is that we wouldn't need as much upfront capital, maybe none at all, depending on how that's structured, and that you just pay a certain amount every month, and that's what it is. It provides the amount of electricity that you need, and that's it. Now, it could be a little bit more expensive than buying it outright. Again, that depends on the size of the system, and all of that sort of stuff would need to be analyzed. And it can sometimes be higher than PPA, but again, it depends on the size of the system and a few other factors. So here again, you're trying to put out the responsibility goes to the energy provider and moves away from the organization. And so it's an energy as a service, and the lease can cover possibly, you know, appliances and stuff, as well as the pure electricity generation. And then with the power purchase agreement, usually this is for slightly larger systems, as we've seen, and it is just you pay for the amount of electricity that you use. That's what we're all kind of used to. We pay an electricity bill. You don't. The difference here is you would be locked into that for maybe 3 to 10 years. So you'd need a long-term agreement. We're used to paying for electricity just with a normal electricity bill, and all the headaches are somebody else's again. We don't have to take any of those on. The idea here again is you don't need a lot of upfront capital, and you don't take the risks, and you're still reducing your costs above where you are, but possibly not as much as in a outright buying it. So it can be more expensive, but again, in cases where you're very large systems with a lot of different customers, it can often be cheaper than trying to do something yourself. But as we are looking at these guarantee mechanisms and long-term LTAs, this is what we need to create in order for these to be applicable to many of the organizations. And also the thing with power purchase agreements, we do have to have regulatory frameworks in place which make it simple and permissible to do these things. So essentially here are the reasons. Why are we doing this? We're looking to transfer responsibilities away from the organization to the energy provider. We're looking to reduce the upfront capital costs, and so that most of that again, and that risk associated with that comes from the energy provider. And then the operation and maintenance is also transferred to the energy provider. And so it can work to lowering the operation costs. It can move things faster. The know-how and experience, you need a certain amount of it to be able to set up this in the first place, but a lot of it is to do with the energy provider themselves, and it can be faster, and you don't need as much money upfront. With all of these, you would try to create local livelihoods by using local resources to build the capacity of local companies so that they're able to properly maintain these and scale up the systems by learning from larger international energy providers that they would work with. And also we would have a lot better data management of what we're using and how it's being produced, what percentage of it comes from clean sources and what it does not. So that's kind of where we're at and why we're looking at PPAs and leasing agreements. It's just a brief overview of what we've somewhat discussed previously. If you want to move on, please, Amy. So we'd be looking at having a neutral sort of approach to energy technology, so we can include whatever it is. We can analyze lots of different systems with the software, which tells us which is the cheapest option, which is the greenest option, etc. And it allows for the development of future technologies. And then the delivery models, we already have a lease, but what we're working on now is lease or possibly lease to own, and a power purchase agreement where we either pay something every month, which is fixed, or we pay just for the electricity that we use, or a combination of some of those is possible also. So any questions on that, please?
Excellent. Thank you, Paul. As Paul said right at the beginning, this is just to give an introduction of where we're at and where we would like to go. I don't see any questions or comments in the chat. So does anyone like to raise a hand to discuss anything? I'd be surprised if there is anything, because this is where we have been discussing over the last 12 months or so, looking at the way forward with UN agencies. Okay, yes, we do have a question. So Camilla, if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask the question that you just put in the chat box. Hello, Camilla.
Yeah, sure. It just took me a while, sorry. No, I was just wondering, in whichever context you're thinking of, why would a lease to own be preferable to a lease without the transfer of asset ownership at the end of the contract?
Yep, it's an interesting question. And it could be, lease to own could be preferential in a number of reasons. For instance, if we're looking, or an agency is actually looking to bolster, in-country capacity. So we're looking at the host country and, increasing their own infrastructure and their own capacity. So after the term of the lease, that actually the ownership, could actually pass on to, a cooperative or a local partnership, or indeed the agency itself, if it has the capacity internally to take on and move that up. But to be honest, one of the things that we have been talking about the last 12 months with the UN agencies is this lack of capacity, especially at the country level, to be able to really manage and own this and operate. So it's there just as an option, but it's not necessarily one that we have a strong desire to go towards at this moment in time. And as capacity increases in these countries, then maybe it's a model that we move to at this moment in time. Any other questions? Mary-Ann, you have a question to Paul. I think, Paul, you mentioned a software package in your presentation.
Yeah, I was just kind of referring to things like Homer, where you're analyzing the outputs and the costs of a system, and you might have solar diesel hybrid, or then you might have another one with solar battery diesel hybrid, and you can compare those. So you would use that type of software, for instance, to analyze which one would be the best. And we'll be looking a little bit later at then how do we financially analyze lease or lease to own or power purchase agreements to see which one of those is more effective from an economic point of view. That's all.
Oh, great, thanks, Paul. Any other questions before we move on? Okay, excellent. Well, good. We're ahead of schedule at this moment in time. Amy, next slide, please. I'd like to hand over to Gregory Sonef from UNDP, who's their procurement technical lead. And Gregory will go through the RFP process. He'll also provide comment on the existing RFP that UNDP have for photovoltaic solutions, and also raises a few questions about what to consider as we go forward. So thank you, Gregory, for preparing the slides and providing the presentation. Over to you.
No worries. Thanks, Mark. And yeah, so my name is Greg Sonef. I'm based in UNDP's procurement services, I'm in UNDP's procurement services unit based in Copenhagen. And am responsible for the team here that's actually providing support so far to our procurement support around renewable energy solutions, and have established a number of LTAs and are working kind of with our country offices around some of these kind of solutions. And so we'll get more into that. But I'm going to caveat the rest of my presentation here with the fact that, I mean, I'm definitely not a technical expert, and what little I have learned over the last little while around renewable energy and especially from the procurement point of view, there's technical people in UNDP and in the team here that are much better equipped to answer any of those kind of questions. But really, I think the idea was not to go into a great deal of detail on the actual tender process, because when we talk about public procurement and procurement across the UN agencies, I mean, the overall process is hopefully relatively the same and relatively well known. But just to look at kind of a brief overview of the process and some of the areas that we would focus on, and then some of the particular questions or aspects that are unique perhaps to this kind of this environment and this requirement that we have now. So I'll try and go relatively quickly through just how we approached it and some of the lessons perhaps that we've learned, and then open up for any questions. But I think as far as the process itself goes, right, the first part and where we invested a lot of energy in the very beginning was really around planning and strategy. And here, the idea was to understand kind of the primary objectives and requirements that we actually really wanted to get out of this. So what did we, Mark mentioned in the beginning, having a number of LTAs and being, for these kind of solutions. So really even going beyond that and saying, well, okay, what are we using these LTAs for? Who are the end users? What is the demand? In UNDP, at least, we have operations support, but we also have program support that we provide to governments and other things as well. So it's how do we capture potentially both, or did we want to capture both, and what considerations do we want to make, and identifying that from a global perspective. So really that's where this idea of defining the primary objectives, identifying who are the major stakeholders, and looking at kind of creating the project team. So who is going to provide input? Where do we have technical expertise? Where do we lack technical expertise? Where do we need commercial inputs and those things? And agree then about who's taking the roles and responsibilities and who's doing what throughout the process, and who's managing which components. Initially, I think that we defined a procurement timeline, and ultimately, this one was quite a bit lengthier than we originally planned, in the sense that there was a lot of detail, a lot of steps, and a lot of information that we were lacking. And so it was definitely important to kind of invest that time up front, though. Then the next step being, looking at the actual technical requirements. So what are we looking at? And here, not just talking about the solar capacity and the number of megawatts or the size of the system that we're looking at, but really looking at, again, what are the specific requirements on the ground? What are the differences across the country offices or across the projects that we're working with? And making sure that we have technical expertise in-house or externally, or wherever that might be, to help define where that was lacking, especially when it comes to on the ground, understanding the needs in each country office or each country that we're working with. And also kind of defining the commercial and company expertise. So identifying here at this stage too, what is it that we're looking for? What is it that we want a company to do? How are we establishing that kind of baseline criteria? And less so when we were talking about the grant-based procurement, but mainly, especially as we get more into the PPA or leasing agreements, or even in some of the cases where we're looking at settling back to the grid or these kinds of things. What are the legal frameworks that are existing and that we need to kind of work within? And I think the step that we really spent a lot of time on and did a lot of kind of in-depth research on, and I think is super critical, especially in this process as well going forward, is identifying suppliers and us understanding the market, understanding how the market is structured, understanding who are the key players, how are they organized, and how well does that then match with the overall requirements and objectives that we have and the business model that we're looking at. Are we looking at a regional supply base? Are we looking at a global suppliers that are able to work with us? What are the kind of demand levels? Are they interested in smaller projects, larger projects? But really understanding kind of from their perspective, how do they view us as a client, for example, and get a sense of who should we target and at what level. And that also includes on a local level, understanding how do we engage with the local companies, how do we engage with projects on the ground, if we have, and I'll come back a little bit to the LTAs we have, right? But looking at if we have global LTA holders, how are they actually engaging through local companies, local partners in each country that we're working with. And for us, we did an expression of interest and asked and used that to solicit a lot of information from the market to find out which kind of suppliers were interested, what kind of solutions were available, how they went about, what projects they had been involved in, and really spent a ton of time gathering that information so that we knew very clearly who we were targeting and how best to actually approach them. And so that was where we went through and did this expression of interest in a pre-qualification process whereby we could hone in a little bit around which companies we were most interested in actually working with, and so that we weren't kind of inundated with 1,000 different requests, but that we also weren't creating our requirements so narrowly that we excluded potential suppliers that were also very interesting. So important to invest quite a bit of time in that upfront process, and then, I mean, the tender process itself obviously is probably the most well known, right? Once we've published a tender and we're asking for offers, this is somewhat familiar territory, right? We know that we're going to need to draft tender documents. We know that we need to establish upfront, though, how we're going to evaluate them. So on what basis are we evaluating suppliers? And for example, in the LTAs that we've got now for grant-based solutions and turnkey solar PV systems, I mean, given the fact that each system that we operate or that we support and we've installed in each country situation is so different, it made it really difficult to try and come up with one type of solution, one type of system. And we wanted to make sure that suppliers were able to demonstrate their ability to cater to the unique situation in each of the countries. And so we developed a number of scenarios, essentially case studies, where we asked them to bid on specific kinds of projects around specific parameters that enabled us to evaluate their ability to design systems, their ability to cater to local requirements, their abilities to also source components, various types of components, various kind of setups and things, so that we could then evaluate them on that basis. And I think going forward for this tender as well, it's going to be extremely important to understand how we're going to conduct that evaluation upfront, even before we actually issue the tender. I mean, we'll need to know, because it is going to be important when we look at how do you cost the various options against each other. How do we make sure that we're providing that kind of support? And so having that thought upfront and structuring that upfront, knowing how we're evaluating both the technical proposals, we're evaluating the financial proposals, the commercial proposals that are coming in, so that we know, and that the LTAs at the end of the day will actually, we're signing LTAs and we're awarding companies that we are confident are going to give us the best technical solutions, but also the best value for money options, right? And how do we make sure that we solicit that as widely, as broadly as possible? How do we communicate our requirements to the market, in a sense that the suppliers are able to then understand clearly what we're looking for? How do we clarify any questions that are out there, both technical, commercial, legal? In a project of this scope, I envision that there's going to be a lot of questions, a lot of companies who perhaps aren't familiar with working with the UN or UN agencies. So how do we answer those kind of questions, and how do we explain and express our requirements? Yeah, so that's I think some important points to keep in mind. Obviously, then we get into kind of the nuts and bolts. Once we've done the evaluation and we've gone through and we have an idea who we're looking to work with, how do we make sure that we get the necessary approvals internally? To what degree do we need to engage our various legal departments or finance departments? And is that something that can be done at a headquarters level, or is this something that is going to need to depend on each country? And how do we then notify the companies and implementing them? And I think that this is also, experience from a lot of the projects that we've been working on, right? Is having these kind of kickoff meetings, meeting with the companies, explaining the process. How are we going to manage these things? What are the expectations? And kind of moving forward to ultimately signing contracts with the agencies. And then the final step being, I would say, some of the most important, right? Making sure that the implementation and management of the contracts. These are highly complex projects, highly often over a longer period of time. They're a large commitment from the agency. So making sure that we're managing suppliers' expectations, and country office expectations, managing the overall implementation of the projects. And in the case of the LTAs that we have, where there are multiple LTAs, where we do what we call a kind of a secondary competition process every time. So for each project, we put them in competition and we evaluate them on a project by project basis. and ensuring that that process is also upheld and maintained as a fair and transparent process amongst the LTA holders, and so that we're ensuring value for money and fairness throughout the entire process review period. So, and then conducting periodic reviews. So going through each time and assessing, what's working, what's not working, what can we change within the scope of the existing LTAs, what can we not change, and how do we kind of move forward. So I think those are things that we would need to consider. I mean, and this is just so far quite high level, quite broad, right? But the message or the lesson learned, I think, from our side is, I mean, it took from kind of start to finish once we started going on. I mean, almost a year to time we went through and did all the analysis, did all the scoping, got everyone on board, did the entire kind of sourcing and evaluation and contract award process and all these. I mean, it took between 9 and 12 months from the time that we initiated this from a very beginning point of view to having something actually signed. So it's a significant investment of time and resources, and I think this tender will likely be the same in the sense that it's a large scope and it's a lot of different stakeholders and parties involved. So this is just, I mean, a few of the questions or a few of the things that kind of popped into our head as we went through this and went, thinking about this tender and thinking about the lessons that we've learned from the other tenders, right? And I think here, when we've got a lot of different agencies, when we've got a lot of different stakeholders involved in the process, understanding roles and responsibilities throughout the process is going to be super important. So where do we have that? Who is taking the lead, who is able to provide what kind of support throughout the process, and what is required from each of the agencies in terms of endorsement later on, making sure that this is something that's applicable for their agency. So I think that it's super important that we have that kind of clear from the beginning. What are the roles and responsibilities, and who will be kind of doing what throughout the process. This idea of, at least within the UN, kind of lead agency or mutual recognition. So, if UNDP, for example, is leading the tender process, then how does that work? And how do we, Mark mentioned about it in the beginning about sharing LTAs and allowing others to piggyback on those LTAs, and just obviously, given that we want this to be applicable for everybody and something that is useful for as broad an audience as possible. We want to make sure that there's opportunities to affect the process as we go through. Questions about who are the main beneficiaries, who are we actually who are we envisioning are the kind of the end users, and within UNDP, I mentioned briefly, but we have our operations, our country offices, and kind of facilities that we're working with, but we also work a lot with projects where it's governments or other donors, and those stakeholders are often quite different and have different requirements sometimes and different ways of working, and where for a lot of the operation side, these are our assets and these are things that we're managing and we're dealing with, whereas in a lot of the other projects and kind of programmatic engagement that we have, I mean, there's a lot of work on behalf of the end users where we're supporting kind of their side. So yeah, and that's also goes into this, envision how the contracts will be implemented. So on what level, who is going to be, dealing with the contracts? Is it a country level? Is it at a HQ level? How are they going to be managed? And talking a little bit about minimum project size or what size scope of projects are we looking at, and maybe being able to award or issue the tender or award LTAs for various sizes, right? So looking at kind of staggered or lots, so that we're able to award multiple LTAs that cover some smaller projects, some larger projects, and projects in between. Financial, legal aspects that need to be considered when we talk about the technical requirements, right? I think that this is something too where there's a lot of elements in one, right? Where when we're talking about PPAs, or we're talking about leasing or leasing to own, it's obviously there's a lot of focus on the commercial. There's a lot of focus on the financial aspects, legal aspects of that also need to be considered in addition to the technical aspects. And so I think there's, how do we balance that out as we go through the evaluation process, because those elements are equally as important sometimes, and probably even more so in the beginning, where we're able to, where less, Paul was talking about kind of the energy neutral solutions, right? And so here, I mean, we're not necessarily trying to limit ourselves to one type of solution, but really, I mean, the financial and commercial aspects are super, super important. Given that we're a pretty broad group of people and lots of stakeholders, and I think, I mean, there's, you know, the questions around technical expertise, technical support. What do we have? Where are we lacking? Do we have, you know, legal support, financial support, all those kind of things? Where do we have things internally that we can leverage, and where would we potentially need to look for external kinds of support? Yeah. And so I think minimum level, when we talk about the commercial side too, minimum level of expertise, minimum level of experience that we're looking for the companies. So when we're looking at pre-qualifying companies, who are we looking to engage? What kind of experience or expertise are we looking for? And this question around local engagement. So how do we engage local markets? How do we engage companies in each country so that we have this kind of anchoring locally as well, and not just global international companies? I touched on it a little bit in the beginning or in the last slide, but I think this element of supplier sourcing is super, super important, and understanding who we're trying to target. How do we communicate, or how do we target kind of global, regional, local? What combination of it is there? Understanding the market is super, super important, and it's definitely not something that I have a super solid grasp on, but understanding, you know, is this one tender? Is it multiple tenders? Is it, you know, at what level? How do we engage for these kinds of solutions? Can we combine them all into one, or is this something that we need to separate out? I think it's super important that we match our strategy and process to the market, so that we understand a little bit how they're going to react if we start to send this kind of information out. Are they going to be able to offer it? Or not? And I think that's something that is super important, because otherwise, I mean, if we don't approach the market in the right way, then they may not be interested, or they may misunderstand, and we lose that opportunity. So this idea of creating or conducting expressions of interest or pre-qualification of various suppliers, I think, is going to be a super important step to understanding who our potential supply market is. The process itself, where defining it a little bit in terms of, it'll be informed a lot by the requirements that we have in the supply market that's out there, but looking at requests for proposals versus ITBs. I mean, when we're looking at something, the ability to qualitatively evaluate the bids that are coming in and evaluate the suppliers that we're seeing, I think is super important, right? So how do we actually score and weight those kinds of things? So the typical lowest price meeting technical requirements may not be the best option, but then we need to understand sort of what are the risks and potential pitfalls of each of the approaches, right? So that we're making sure that there is still a component of value for money, that this is something that we need to make sure that it's the total cost of ownership kind of perspective is built into the tender process. And how are we evaluating, right? This is also a big, super important element to consider already at the beginning, in terms of who is doing the evaluation, how are we evaluating, on what basis. Once we get a lot of people into a room and we start looking at evaluating bids, especially when it becomes, you know, this technical or these kind of solutions, it's super important that there's clarity around how that evaluation is being done. What are the elements? What are we scoring? What are we looking for? And so that there's as little ambiguity as we go through that process as possible. I mentioned the process that we used before around scenarios, right? Can we create kind of scenario cases that we can ask companies to actually bid on, so that we have something quite concrete? So it's not just asking them for, you know, the price of a panel, or the price of a battery, or the price of a kilowatt produced, but basically coming up with some specific solutions, some specific scenarios that we can ask them to bid on, that we can then do the evaluation based upon. The idea of single awards versus secondary competition. If we pre-qualify, are we looking at having exclusive LTAs for certain regions or certain countries or certain types of solutions with certain LTA holders? or are we, if we, the aim, Mark mentioned having 20 LTAs. I mean, the idea there is that we would have a number of LTAs that are potentially pre-qualified that we can then put in competition based on the actual projects that we have. And at what level does that mean? Are there certain projects that are going to be limited to certain types of companies, and how do we deal with that? And this element of the technical financial evaluation, as we're looking at not just the technical solutions that are being proposed, because those are also important, but also the financial side of things, because that's you know, a key award criteria in this situation as well, right? And how do we break it down? And here's, so when we get into the contract and award and negotiation phase, you know, this is also an important thing to, I think, discuss up front and understand and agree on. How do we envision this being operationalized later on? Is this one contract? Is it multiple contracts with each agency? This is something that suppliers are going to ask, right? How are they being engaged? Is it, if they create, if they're awarded, does that mean that 15 different UN agencies and other NGOs or partners will also be using those contracts and signing individual contracts? I think it's, again, companies are not, they differ in terms of how they're set up for managing clients and engaging with different stakeholders. And so it's in terms of managing their expectations, and also in managing kind of internal expectations around how these contracts will actually be operationalized and who's going to kind of take the ball forward. Duration of contracts, especially when we were talking about, you know, leasing or PPA contracts, and the duration of, you know, the longer duration potentially of some of the contracts that we would be supplying, is that aligned with the duration of contracts that we have, right? Because here, if we have an LTA, how long are those contracts actually going to be able to be in place, and will they match then the resulting contracts that we'll have later on? Because especially within the UN world, I mean, long-term agreements are anywhere, I would say, between 2 to 4 or 5 years in most cases, but perhaps we need to evaluate whether there needs to be longer-term contracts even than that in some of these cases. And acceptance of legal conditions. I know this is something that we've discussed, and as we get into these kind of more longer term and financing type of agreements and various things, are there, are suppliers familiar with UN terms and conditions, for example, or what where are we able to be flexible in some of those kind of cases as well? So just, I mean, a few questions to think about as we go forward. And then the last piece, just contract implementation and management. So how do we share information, at what level, and how do we make sure that we're learning as we're going? For agencies, what's the mechanism for inclusion of other agencies or other users as we go through? Pilot projects. This is something that we want to start off with some projects and be able to see how well the process works, or are we jumping straight into kind of LTAs that we're able to deal with, and how do we kind of feedback close the feedback loop in terms of lessons learned after pilot projects, or after like probationary periods of these contracts and what they're going. So rather high level, and a few just questions to, I guess, start some of the discussion, or to feed into some of the discussions perhaps on Thursday and over the coming days, weeks, months. So just the last, this is something I think we can't really stress enough in terms of the more time and energy we can spend and invest in the needs assessment and planning, market assessment, supplier sourcing, and solicitation and evaluation process, the better, right? Because the further along the process we get, then the less flexible the process actually becomes, right? And so there's nothing worse than getting to the end of a tender process and going through the evaluation and realizing that it didn't actually, the suppliers that we got or the offers that we've got aren't actually going to meet the requirements that we have. And so for me, and in the process that we did, investing upfront early, understanding the needs, understanding what we actually wanted to get out of it, is super important. And so understanding the market, doing all that kind of work up front will pay off in dividends, I think, later on in terms of the actual output. Yeah. So that's something that it just needed to be stressed quite a bit in terms of investing the time up front and asking questions and getting the information so that we know and that we can also inform suppliers. So. Just, I mean, I see there's a couple of questions already, and we'll do our best to answer. But just we mentioned already that we went through a process a few years ago now to actually establish LTAs for solar PV, turnkey solar PV solutions across a number of size ranges and different types of accessories so including solar street lights and water pumps and heaters and things as well. But primarily aimed at creating or allowing UNDP, both country offices and projects, to source solar PV, turnkey solar PV solutions. And so that those LTAs are in place. They consist of four lots. So small appliances all the way up to large turnkey PV solutions. We have 14 companies awarded in total across a number of the lots. But what we've done there is we've kind of pre-qualified them, like I said, based on some scenarios, and we have a secondary bidding process. So when a project comes up, we work with the country office, or we work with the project colleagues there and work to identify what are the requirements. What is it specifically that this project, this country situation is, and what do they need? And then help them define those requirements, help them assess what actually, what kind of a solution they're looking for and what is needed, but then to go out through secondary competition to the suppliers and ask them to design a technical solution and provide a commercial, financial proposal. And we do that kind of evaluation later on and award a company for each specific project, so that it allows us some flexibility to be able to design systems and make sure that they actually meet the specific requirements. So it wasn't kind of a one size fits all plug and play model that we wanted to apply. We wanted to make sure that we had that flexibility, we had that the ability to customize and scale the various projects. So it could be everything from one of our country office facilities to 500 health clinics in rural Africa, right? So that we could kind of meet almost everything and all kind of needs across UNDP. One of the key components, so the LTA holders themselves are typically larger international system integrators, if you will. So they're sourcing components from a variety of sources and designing and building systems according to the requirements that we have. But where we wanted to make sure that there's a local partner engagement. So on each of the projects that we are working with, our LTA holders engage with a local partner who is their kind of eyes and ears on the ground, and somebody who is anchoring the project and liaising directly with our country offices and responsible for the ongoing maintenance, ongoing support to the system. And so really building that capacity at a local level as well, and making sure that it wasn't just delivering a system at the doorstep and then leaving it for them to kind of manage on their own. Yeah, and so far, I mean, it's been grant-based solutions only. So there's no real provisions for alternative financing agreements such as leasing or PPA. It's really been focused on grant-based solutions where we have upfront capital and we're able to either UNDP or the end user becomes the beneficiary of the system and manages and operates the system going forward. Yeah, so I think when we talk this one again, I mean, and we go back a little bit to my initial discussion, right? Requirements and available options will likely be highly dependent on local context. And I think it's super important. It's super important to understand kind of what that local context is. How do we differentiate our approach based on project size, location, the context, on-grid, off-grid, various kind of components? What are the things that we need to think about as we're issuing this tender? What are the kind of the things that we need to think about in terms of managing that? Yeah, flexibility on legal requirements I touched on a little bit, and these kind of contract duration considerations and what type of companies we're trying to attract. So So just again, a few questions, a few things to think about to spur the conversations on Thursday and over the coming period. So.
Great. Thank you very much, Gregory. Let me just speak for a little while so I can catch your breath and before I fire all the questions at you. But yeah, thank you very much. And I think it becomes very clear just the amount of effort that is required to develop an RfP and get a long-term agreement signed with, you know, appropriate energy service companies. So, I mean, that's exactly why we're here today. You know, when we were first discussing this with UNDP, there was a thought process around that, you know, if every agency has to go through this process and wants to do it themselves, there's a lot of duplication of effort. It's a lot of, you know, by that waste of time in trying to reinvent the wheel. So UNDP were very open and said that they would like to use the sort of contractual documents that were sort of drafted with GIZ at the end of last year and the sort of de-risking tool that we're working with Energy MRC, we'll introduce them shortly, to, you know, develop a long-term agreement for power purchase agreements and lease agreements, but opening it up to other agencies right at the design phase, so that if there is an interest with your organization to piggyback the whole of the workflow, as we discussed in Workstream 1, or just piggyback the LTA and do the procurement process using UNDP's approach would be possible. So it's about engaging, crowdsourcing your knowledge and making this process as simple for everyone else in that, and getting your, as we move forward to sort of concrete activities, you know, making sure that we develop something that is fit for purpose in the humanitarian space, using the skills within UNDP, given that they've already got one LTA for grant-based solutions to, you know, use that. So that's enough of me. Hopefully, Greg, you've got your breath back and we can fire a few questions across you. So I'd like
Sure.
to
I can, yeah.
Go on, Greg.
No, I was just, I was looking kind of through the chat as well, and so I can maybe just kind of go through a little bit, and some of them I'll need to defer a little bit and say that I can answer perhaps in writing a little later on once we have some of the more detailed information. But I mean, if we look at just the first kind of questions around the evaluation process, what parameters did we identify and what scoring structure did we set up? I mean, so here, like I say, we used some scenarios. So within each of the sizing and lots, we essentially put together some scenarios and said, this is, you know, one context, this is one type of project that we wanted the suppliers to actually bid upon. And so then we looked at how they designed the technical solution. So how, you know, based on this kilowatt capacity, for example, or this integration with the grid or other things, how did they design the system? So there was the whole technical evaluation around that. And then looking at, you know, what were the type of components that they were sourcing, what are the prices that they were actually offering, and delivery, and all these kinds of things. And so that was something that was I mean, I can share perhaps more the detailed scoring setup around that and some of the things that we mentioned. But because it was such a difficult, because it's so difficult to evaluate, kind of, you know, here's one solution, here's one set, you know, what's the price of a panel or the price of a battery or you know, length of cables and all these kind of things. We created scenarios that we were then able to say, okay, here's one case, bid on that concrete case in a specific country context, that we were able to actually kind of look at it that way. The number of companies that actually expressed interest and how many bidders answered the RfP, I'll need to come back with the exact numbers. But like I say, we ended up with about 14 different LTA holders that we signed contracts with. Not all, I would say there wasn't so many more initially. I mean, in terms of kind of the companies that that at least bid. The expression of interest, I'll need to come back on exactly how many companies expressed interest, but it was some years ago. So keeping in mind that this was, I think, at the end of 2018 or so. So I mean, it's been a little bit of time, and I mean, the market moves quite quickly. The past tender documentation, I believe we can share. It shouldn't be a problem. So I think that we can send out the tender that was used. I mean, keeping in mind that it was shared some time ago, right? And within a specific context of UNDP's requirements. So, I mean, it has been a great, I mean, I consider it a major success from our side, and it's been super helpful. But, as the market changes and as things evolve, then there's lessons learned that we would probably change now as well. So the idea to how do we evaluate the bidder's availability to operate in various geographic locations? So that was one of the requirements that we asked in the tender, was were there any locations that they were not able to work in? And also, as we go through the secondary bidding process, it's super important for us that that suppliers highlight that we highlight the expectation that they identify a local partner, and that's a mandatory requirement from our side. So if companies aren't able to find local partners or aren't able to find someone who is able to work on the ground locally and secure that capacity there, then it's they're disqualified in principle from participating in the tender. So that was a clear message from our side, was that this was something that we wanted to make sure that there was some kind of anchoring at a local level as well. And do we make it a requirement for the pre-qualified contractors to be able to operate in a list of countries? Yeah, there's a few. I mean, we've had a few questions around from contractors and stuff around places where there's active conflicts or post-crisis zones and various things where there's security conditions, and we've had to make kind of specific arrangements essentially to support them. We did a project in Yemen, for example, where, I mean, it wasn't always possible, or it wasn't possible for the suppliers from Europe and things to actually visit the site on the ground. So we were working largely remotely through a local partner. But for the large part, I think there are very few countries where they weren't able to actually operate. Was the flexibility to adapt and update established technical requirements as a result of the information gathered and the expression of interest? Yes, and I think that was one of the major things that we wanted out of the expression of interest, was to understand what technical requirements, how should we build the scenarios, how should we what types of solutions were we looking for, and also now when we awarded the LTAs, we wanted to make sure that they, I think there was another question later on too that was talking about kind of adapting for price changes and technology changes. And I think this is also something we didn't want to link ourselves to one specific type of solution or one specific type of panel manufacturer or anything else. So we wanted to we were targeting specifically companies who were able to kind of be system integrators, who were able to source from multiple sources, who were able to evolve as, even in the LTAs, we don't have a catalog of, this is the type of panels or this is the type of solutions, or we use some ceiling prices that we refer back to. But in principle, really what we wanted to do was create that flexibility. So we didn't want to limit ourselves, because we knew that the requirements varied as much as they did, and that the market was changing as fast as it was. So as the, if the prices for components are going down, or if the new technology is coming on board and we're able to look at new types of batteries or various things, then ultimately we wanted our LTA holders to be able to source that. So that was something where we weren't specifically targeting one type of solution. Did you approach the private sector, or am I missing to skip a question? No. Did you approach the private sector, and did you conduct market analyses before the EOI? Or did the EOI only cover international or also local firms? The EOI was published internationally, but primarily it was, I would say, global or European based, or companies that expressed the main interest. But we also tried as much as we could to get the word out kind of locally as well. We did get a few companies that expressed interest from developing countries and that were considered as well. But here again, I mean, it really depends on kind of what we were trying to achieve and the market that we were trying to look at. How flexible is the process in balancing resources, time, and scope limitations? Not sure I totally understand the question, but I think here it's important, I would say, and it goes a little bit back to my slide about the investment of time up front. I think you can't underestimate the fact that this will take a significant investment of time, resources, in order to do it properly, in order to invest the time up front, to understand, to develop all the documentation, to do the market assessment, to understand, even simple things like doing holding kind of workshops or bidder conference meetings before, so that we're able to communicate with the market, so that we're able to answer all the questions that are going to come in, right? I think that even in our tender, there was loads of questions that come from suppliers around, not just technical things, but the type of projects, the type of environments that we're working in. If companies aren't used to working in a UN context, it can, it raises a number of questions that they'll need to answer as well. So it's important to I think invest the time and resources and scope. And given the number of agencies, the number of kind of interests that are here, and the scope of the requirements and things of this, it's going to take some time, right? Because I think lots of people are going to have questions, and if we want an outcome that is going to meet the needs of the vast majority of the people who are interested in using the outcome, then I think we need to make sure too that there's lots of time throughout the process for discussing, for agreeing on, one way versus another way, the one strategy versus another strategy. So it'll be important to invest the time and resources up front, and not underestimate that this is something that we can do in a couple of weeks' time. I mean, it really is going to take some time to invest, but that investment up front, I think, will pay dividends later on. This is we include a renegotiating prices clause due to the ever-changing price of solar panels. So this is really where the secondary bidding component comes in. So we have some ceiling prices agreed in the LTAs, but here we do periodic. Because of the secondary bidding, we're asking suppliers to go out and source real time, more or less, once as projects become available, so that we haven't kind of locked ourselves into one pricing component as we go through. So that's a way that we've been able to secure that as we go through, and make sure that we're getting best value for money, and evaluating even across the projects that we have, and over time being able to see, do we see any trends in terms of pricing? Do we see are certain suppliers consistently more expensive than others, or stuff like that? I think is super important as well. Would it be possible to piggyback on UNDP's current LTAs? The answer is maybe, and to be a little bit ambiguous, but in principle, I mean, there is flexibility, or there is an opportunity here. What's important for us is that we, the scope, the modality, the methodology of how we apply these LTAs is consistent whenever they're shared as well. And so that it's something that, for example, I mean, even in UNDP, these aren't kind of open to UNDP country offices directly. It's something that's managed centrally from our offices here. And we work, of course, with country offices and to implement them. But it's because of the way that the requirements that we have in terms of documenting the secondary bidding process, and making sure that we're, we have a clear audit trail in terms of how contracts are actually being awarded out of this, and things. This is something that we, and the management of suppliers and the management of projects, it's something that we focus a lot on. And so that's actually a requirement from our contracts review committee, is that these things are managed from a central point of view. So when we're asking, or when agencies ask about piggybacking, it's just something too where we need to make sure that those principles, those kind of guidelines and things like this are also upheld, and that, suppliers and things like that have the capacity to be able to deal with the requirements that are in there. So what are the 4 lots, and what does an agency who wants to piggyback? So hopefully I've answered the piggybacking component. The lots really were, looking kind of, I would say, growing in size. So one of the assumptions that we had in the beginning, at least, was that the size of the systems, the kind of megawatt capacity or kilowatt capacity and peak capacity of the systems and things like that were, we tried to target smaller companies for some of the smaller systems or smaller appliances, but also some of the larger companies as we get into some of the larger turnkey types of solutions. Now, in terms of the actual awards of contracts, it didn't kind of pan out in the same exact way, but that was the lots are designed to look at kind of small, medium, large types of systems and the scope of some of those. So I don't know if that answers at least a few of the questions that are there. I mean, people are more than welcome to write, or we can have the conversation, I think, on Thursday as well, if there's any questions. But hopefully, yeah, that's an initial answer, at least from my side.
Great, thank you, Greg. And you've actually finished right on schedule. So thank you. I think that's a very good overview of the process. As I said, I'm talking about the sort of complexities. Maybe we can move on to the next slide. So thank you very much, Greg, and we look forward to your involvement again on Thursday with your colleague Raphael as well. Now I'd like to introduce Robert Yates from the Energy Market and Regulatory Consultants, who are based in the UK. They are presently working with a coordination unit with financial and technical support from Shell on a de-risking mechanism. So those that were in the workshops last year talking about PPAs and lease agreements and the UN's need for the termination clause, Energy MRC have been brought on board to work on that, and hopefully we'll have something very good to share with you in the coming weeks, not months. So that's where Energy MRC come from. And specifically what Robert will be running through today is the sort of common pitfalls or common mistakes, or where we need to focus our energy on to make sure that when the RFP has gone out, the actual bids that come back are, you know, good quality, you know, low risk to the agencies, and provide a sort of cost-efficient solution. So thank you very much, Robert, for agreeing to provide this presentation and from doing the slides. So over to you. And as ever, if you have any questions or comments, please do drop them in the chat box and we'll pick those up at the end. So over to you, Robert, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. And thank you for the words of introduction. As Mark said, my name is Robert Yates. I'm with Energy Market and Regulatory Consultants in the UK. We are working with GPA at the moment on developing their de-risking tool and mechanism, and I will touch on that during the course of this presentation. We're also working with UNHCR on their program for switching their various facilities across from diesel generation across to renewable generation. So we have parallel streams of activity, and I'll be drawing on some of that during the course of this short presentation. You're going to embark on an unusual procurement. You've got a particular set of problems to encounter which may not be very consistent with your day-to-day procurements. In particular, for this sort of solar PV generation, and particularly if a PPA is going to be used, then the bids are relatively expensive for the bidders to assemble in both time and money. In all likelihood, you're going to be asking them to design the facility that they're going to provide to you. And I'll touch on this a little more in the next slide. But they're going to be doing design work. If you're going out to bid for a number of facilities in parallel, then they've got a significant design challenge in front of them. If they're going to be using a PPA, or you're going to be using a PPA, then you're going to need the energy service company to finance the provision of the equipment to you, and they've got to go out and raise that finance, and they need to know they've got that finance in place before the bid is submitted. So that's an extra layer of work, and quite hard work for them as well, to put the package together. So have in mind at all times that what you're asking for is quite a time-consuming and expensive bid. The market is buoyant at the moment, so good bidders are very busy. Their business development teams are a scarce resource, and they'll be quite choosy what they care to bid for. In international terms, the sort of projects that the humanitarian agencies are looking at are relatively small, so you will have difficulty getting onto the radar screen of some of the more credible providers. Bear in mind too, that from their perspective, any post-award negotiation is also going to be very, very expensive and time-consuming for their business development team. And they will be particularly wary of bids that look like they're going to require a substantial amount of negotiation, because what is required or what is the contractual arrangements have not been tightly specified. So an unprofessional RFP will act as a deterrent to the best bidders.
Robert, can I just jump in very quickly? There's a few sound issues. Do you mind just trying with your video off, just to see if that will improve the quality of the sound? Sorry about that. And apologies, everyone. Thank you, Robert. Very good.
Right. I hope that's better. I hope that's clearer. Is that any better, Mark?
Unfortunately, it's not much better. Is there a microphone or anything?
Let me just try getting the microphone a little bit nearer to me. Is that any better? Is that any better, Mark?
No, it seems to be very intermittent. I'm suffering. And I'm beginning, I can follow, but I think there's quite a few people that are really struggling.
Let me just try and pop a headset on.
Okay, thank you, Robert.
Just bear with me, my apologies. Is that any better?
Yeah, sounds it. Carry on.
Good. Okay. Well, fingers crossed that the technology is going to cooperate. Right. Our response in these circumstances: standardized documentation would be a great help, and documentation with which the bidders can become familiar. If they see a bid coming out and the documents look familiar with what they've seen from other bids, it's less time to understand, and they know it's a set of documents they can work with. I'll come on the next slide, I think, to talk about full information, detailed functional requirements, full contract documentation, details of guarantees and insurance and regulations, but finally, a well-focused shortlist. They will weigh up the cost of bidding against their chances of winning, and if they see a long and random list of bidders, that too will act as a deterrent, bearing in mind their costs of bidding. Okay, next slide, please, Amy. Right, a headline here before we look at the RFP contents. Currently, solar plants in Africa have a working life closer to 20 months than the 20 years which we might expect, and that's largely due to flawed procurement. As I've just mentioned, as far as possible with your RFP contents, standardize these, and if it was at all possible, if all the humanitarian agencies could migrate towards a standardized set of bidding documents, then that would be hugely helpful to all the parties engaged in the process and will equally help the bidders. We're going to work through what we would see as the contents of an RFP, starting off with a set of bidding instructions, which I'm sure I don't need to go into detail to explain to you all. We would expect to see an information memorandum, which will give a detailed description of your project or projects, site energy audits, photos and maps. We're going to expect our bidders to visit each site, but if they've got information to hand, those visits can be relatively short and inexpensive. The next part is particularly important. What do you want to buy? And this is where you set out what it is that you want. Now we've set out three options: a high-level design stroke specification, a full functional specification, or a detailed design. It's important that you tell them what you want. If you leave it to the bidders to offer you something, you will never be able to choose between the myriad different options that are provided to you. If you give a high-level design, then again, you will struggle because you will get very different offerings from the different bidders and you will struggle to choose between them. If you provide a detailed design, then there's every danger that you will exclude quite a number of bidders from bidding because they don't have the technology that matches exactly your detailed design. So in every case, we recommend most strongly a full functional specification that sets out not what it looks like, but what you want it to do. The power you want it to deliver, the peak power you want it to deliver, the power at different times of the day and night, the power at different times of the year, the engineering standards which are to be met, the electrical protection, and so on, and so on, and so on. And when I ask my engineers, what does that full functional specification look like? They'll say that for an example, 100 to 500 kilowatt plant, that is a 40 to 50 page document if it's going to cover as well the backup and the operation and maintenance. And only by delivering that full functional specification will you protect yourself from the early failure of the plant, because remember that quite a lot of these providers haven't been in business long enough to have built a plant that has operated for 20 years. Some of them have only been in the market for a single figure number of years. They won't have the experience to necessarily know what the engineering standards are that are required. Also, how you're going to pay for this. Is it a monthly fee, payment for capacity, or payment for energy? And in each case, we would argue payment for capacity. And by that, we mean you're buying a certain amount of energy delivered to you. You don't want to pay for the kilowatt hours because the buyer, the seller, is then worried about the volume risk. Are you actually going to buy all the power that he can deliver? If you're paying for capacity, you're paying for the energy that is made available. It's your responsibility whether you use it or not. But on the other hand, if the plant is down and not fully operational, then you are not paying for it. And there are strong incentives for the seller to keep the plant operational 24 hours a day, 365 days of the year. We expect in the pack to be the contract documents, particularly a PPA and a site lease. Some people seem surprised that you're going to need to provide a site lease, but you're going to ask somebody to put a plant in place, their plant, remember, for the duration of a PPA, and they want to know that where they're going to put that plant, they've got security of tenure. On the PPA, we've seen examples of just heads of terms being included. We've seen examples of a negotiable draft. So this is what we think it should look like, but we're open to offers from our bidders, or a restricted negotiable draft, which we term as, this is what we say it's going to be. This is what our PPA looks like. You're free in your reply to us in the bid to mark it up and say that you want to negotiate this clause and how you want to change it. And when we come to the negotiation, the only clauses that we will look at will be those that you have marked up. And if you try to negotiate anything else, then we will be off to the second bidder. You need to give some thought to the regulatory requirements, permits and licenses. And again, whose responsibility is this going to be? Are you as the buyer going to find the licenses for them and include them in the pack? Are you going to tell them that that's the seller's responsibility and that they need to make sure that they have got the necessary permissions and any license if they need one. Next 2 points to go in the pack: guarantees and security and insurance arrangements. Again, you need a full description of what is being included so they know how they can benefit from these products, but also example wording where it's available so that they fully understand what's on offer, or you may not get the benefit of the hard work that's been done in getting guarantees in place and getting insurances. Mark mentioned that we're working on a risk mitigation project for GPA at the moment. And in part, this will be, looks like it's going to be, partially a guarantee, which will give short-term liquidity cover to provide sellers with up to a year of payment in the event of termination. And then an insurance product, which will be a subscription to a global insurance product to pay out on termination caused by a force majeure event. Amy, if you can jump on and jump on again and again. Thank you. And then to complete the package, any credit enhancement arrangements which can be put in place. Remember, they've got to arrange finance to provide you with this equipment, but there are credit enhancement facilities available in the marketplace. For example, CEDA provides a guarantee mechanism through Stanbic across Africa, which these sellers could benefit from and would help lower the price to you, and they can't assume that they will be available, they will be aware of what is available. A proposed timetable needs to be included, and then what you expect as the response from the bidders. We can jump on, Amy. Thank you. To run through quickly, what do we expect back from the bidders? If you haven't obtained it at expression of interest time, their technical and financial qualifications. You want to know that their key personnel are qualified and they have the qualifications to put such a plant in place for you. You want to know they've got previous experience of having done this sort of project in the sort of geographical setting that you're asking them to operate in, and you want to know that they've got the capability to operate long term in the jurisdiction where the bid is taking place. The design of the plant and the O&M plan, and again, it's their response to your technical evaluation, to your technical requirements, and it's going to need separate technical evaluation. There are variations to the functional specification. If they have departed from your functional specification, you want them to draw them to your attention, and they must comply with any functional specification, but they're also free to propose improvements, and it would be useful for them to be able to draw those to your attention. Exceptions to the contract documents, so marked up copies of the PPA and the site lease, and those are the only clauses which you are going to negotiate with them if they are the preferred bidder. A financing plan, because very often financing plans have complexities built into them. You're now involving a third party, probably a bank or other lending agency, who might have their own conditions. So you want to understand what the financing plan is and whether that has a knock-on effect to the negotiation of the bid. A price expressed as monthly capacity payments. Your PPA should include indexation arrangements, which they will have computed to arrive at an average monthly price. And then finally, an implementation plan, taking them through negotiation, PPA signing, financial close, construction, and plant operation. Just a few words on the bidding process before I finish. compilation of the shortlist. Again, we've heard from Gregory ideas around pre-qualification, open tender, a framework contract, or indeed an invited list. And I think in each case, we would recommend pre-qualification so you've got an understanding of your bidders' technical and financial qualifications and the strength of their management team. And you've got a basis to put together a shortlist. And on the size and content of that shortlist, you will be in a much stronger position if you can have a shortlist, maybe 4, but no more than 6 bidders who you are sure are going to bid and can deliver a quality bid for you, rather than a speculative long list, which will act as a deterrent to some of the better qualified bidders. Relatively speaking, and in international terms, most of the projects we're talking about are small by international standards. So if you can package a group of sites together and let it as one contract, then that will show up on the radar screen of more bidders and you will get better quality bids as a result. But be careful if you're putting together a package which spans more than one country, because that might pose problems for your bidders if they don't have local O&M support in each country, or you're dealing with different regulatory requirements which some bidders may not be familiar with. We've been seeing quite a number of national bidders as well as international bidders, and you want to attract both onto your shortlist. Sequencing of the package. If you've got 10 lots within one package that you're putting out to bid, do you ask the bidder to implement those in parallel as quickly as he can, or do you have them implement them sequentially and perhaps leave yourself wriggle room to have a break clause if he looks like he's not performing, or that penalty clauses might be introduced if performance is poor? Tender adjudication. This is quite a difficult area. No matter how comprehensive your full functional specification, you're still going to finish up with bids which might offer you extras or what appear attractive extras. Some systems offered to you might look to be portable. Some of them might have extra capacity, flexibility for expansion and easy upgrade if you need additional capacity in the future. So there might be a number of features, and you also want to be sure that the bids that have been offered do actually meet the specification. So you're going to need technical evaluation. Now, when you come to the bid, are you going to say there's a technical threshold and that anything that passes the technical threshold we then adjudicate on price? Or are you going to try and use some sort of point system to give a weighting to the technical marks and a weighting to the price with a minimum technical floor for the technical adjudication? And finally, negotiation. Negotiation has the danger that it can run on for weeks, for months, and I was being told the other week about a recent example where the negotiation had dragged on for 2 years. Very expensive, very time consuming, and ultimately frustrating for all sides. But we are going to be dealing with complex contractual arrangements. So trying to restrict to only the marked up items that have been submitted with the bid is key, and that will constrain the scope of the negotiation. Lovely, thank you very much. I'm afraid I've run over time a little bit, but I hope that hasn't been a problem. Questions?
Thank you very much, Robert, and apologies to everyone for the sound quality issues at the beginning. But yeah, just to say thanks once more, Robert. I think that ties in nicely from the presentation given previously by Greg, where this is a very complex process that we need a lot of inputs and a lot of thought as we go through and consider each of those. So thank you for giving it the sort of non-UN perspective. You know, I think sometimes we focus on, you know, our own needs and experience, when I think there's, you know, other opportunities and experience that we can get through from the private sector. So thanks very much. There is a couple of questions in the chat space. So anyone else, while I asked Robert to address these, please do type away. But Robert, the first question is from my colleague Thomas, and he's asking, to what extent does the sort of approach that you've laid out in the presentation change when it's a leasing model, or is it pretty much the same as a PPA?
I guess I don't see a strong dividing line between PPA and leasing. They're similar names for similar processes, because you can include all the responsibilities into a lease and it looks like a PPA, or you can restrict the responsibilities on a PPA and it looks like a lease. So there's a grey area between the two where they can look one like the other quite easily. I think the process is going to be the same. Clearly, if you're going for a simplified form of lease where you're accepting that you're really just buying the equipment and you're not putting onerous responsibilities for operating the equipment onto the seller, then that simplifies the whole process during the procurement stage. It's going to leave you with a nightmare during the operational stage, because what you need to be aware of is that most of the equipment that you have will come with guarantees of one sort or another, manufacturer guarantees. But when it goes wrong, then you're into an argument between your lease provider and the manufacturer about whose responsibility it is that it's not functioning. And you might be sitting there with no power while that argument is being resolved. So if you go down the PPA route and you say to your seller, it's your responsibility to keep it working, I'm only going to pay you for the days when it is working, and I don't care if it's not working. I don't care whether it's your fault and it's a problem with the installation, or whether it's the manufacturer's fault. It's your responsibility to fix it, and it's your responsibility to keep it working. And I expect you not to be paid for the capacity I don't get, and I might well be charging you for the cost of backup as well, depending on how the PPA is worded.
Great, thank you, Robert. The next question is from Marianne from GIZ. She also thanks you, Robert. What are your thoughts on the role of technical specification in bidding documents for PPA cases when the vendor contractually guarantees the energy user the energy to be supplied?
Sorry, Mark, I missed the last few words.
Okay, I'll repeat the question. What are your thoughts on the role of technical specifications in bidding documents for PPA cases when the vendor contractually guarantees the energy user the energy to be supplied?
That is a good question. I would urge caution, because we're seeing examples across Africa where we've got enthusiastic bidders, but slightly inexperienced bidders, or experienced bidders, but using inexperienced local contractors, so that what is built doesn't actually come to a very high technical standard. And you find out late in the day it's not performing. Now, it might be some comfort to you to say, well, I'm not paying for this equipment when it's not working, and it is the seller's responsibility to fix it when it's not working. But what you actually want is a plant that is reliable and works day in, day out, because you're all concerned with other issues of looking after refugees and the other humanitarian services, and you just want the power to be there when you need it to be there. So a strong technical specification, a detailed technical specification, is your insurance against an inexperienced operator or an operator who is using inexperienced local contractors for the installation. So the more detailed the technical specification, the better protected you will be.
Thank you. And I think that goes some way to answering Benedetta's question. If we get more time, we'll come back to see if there's any refinements on that, but we are running a little bit short of time. So Mark Shashner from UNHCR says, the approach you present, is the approach you present capable of fitting into the model as described by Gregory? You know, first we have an expression of interest, then intent to bid procurement of systems integrator, then secondary bidding.
I think that I can't see the advantage of going down that route. Yes, for the first step of an EOI, that is going to be advantageous in nearly all circumstances. I think Gregory was talking about getting a list of prices for components, and from that you'd have a secondary bidding round of how they might put that together as a package. And I'm not sure how that two-stage process helps you at all, because you're wanting a system which will deliver on a particular site, and you're not interested in the prices of the individual components. And indeed, you may not want to know how many of the individual components go into it. You only want to know that this is the total price for delivering the functional specification that you have put forward. So I can see that if you were purchasing a system, you might want to go down that route. But if you're purchasing a service, then I can't see what the advantage might be.
That's really interesting, Robert, and I think one we would like to explore in more detail going forward to get your thoughts on that. But so no, thank you. Very interesting question, Mark, and yeah, some thought to take forward. Next question from Raphael from UNDP. Can we introduce penalties for days that the system's not working?
Almost the other way around, that you're only paying for the capacity that is delivered to you.
Okay.
So if you've bought a 100 kilowatt plant, if there's a day when it's not working, your PPA is worded as I'm paying so much per kilowatt per day. And if it's not working one day, you don't pay for it. Mm. It's going to be a little bit more complicated than that, because there are different components, and it's quite possible on a solar PV system for, say, the panels to be working, but the batteries to be down, or the panels to be working, but the inverter to be down. So there might be some delivery of what you want. It may not be a complete failure of the plant, but the PPA should still put you in a position that you're only paying for what is delivered to you hour by hour and day by day. And that acts as a penalty on the seller and will ensure that he works judiciously to keep the equipment fully functioning.
Excellent. And then there's a follow-up question from Raphael, and he's asking, is there anything additional that we need to consider if it's a lease to own? Is there a specific clausing that we need to look into about handing over? And is that another big kettle of fish?
Well, it's a very big kettle of fish, but just to try and boil it down quickly, you've got three options at the end of a PPA. And let's say we would typically recommend a PPA of 10 years duration. That lowers the cost to a reasonable degree. But if you've got a battery system, the guarantees on most batteries at the moment are around 10 years. So you would put your bidder in a good position that he can procure batteries which have got a manufacturer's guarantee for the duration of the PPA. And when the PPA expires, you'll probably be in a position where you want to go out to rebid for further O&M of the plant and provision of a new set of batteries. So at the end, you've got three options. The seller can own the plant, or you could own the plant, or you could buy the plant from the seller. And our general advice is what might seem intuitively unattractive, which is you buy the plant from the seller at the end of the lease. And we recommend that because you want the seller to leave the plant in reasonably good condition. It won't be worth very much after 10 years. You can write in a ceiling for the price to protect your position, but you want him to carry on with good maintenance up until the end of the PPA. So if you're buying it from him, then that will help to keep him honest, and then you will have the plant. It should have another 10 to 15 years of operational life, and you will be in possession of the plant and can choose whether you go out for O&M plus new batteries, or you just hire your own plant engineer to run it for you and not contract out the service at all from that point onwards.
Thank you. We've got time for probably one or two more questions. I'll just keep an easy one. Hopefully this isn't an easy one. Question from Abdulaziz. What is the shortest PPA leasing agreement from the user the vendor usually accepts?
I think the vendor will be fairly happy with any duration of agreement, because a lot of them are really interested in selling you equipment. The PPA arrangement and the financing of it is a burden to them, and the longer the term of finance, the more of a challenge it is to them. So if you're going out for a 2 or 3 year arrangement, then that will still be attractive to them. The benefit to you is that you're only going to make a significant, to get the price, the capacity payments to be attractive to you, you probably need to be looking at a term of 7 to 10 years, or you're going to face a big hike in your monthly costs. In the work we've been doing for UNHCR, we've been looking at arrangements where the price of the capacity payments would not be greater than the cost of the diesel generation. And that's pointing towards PPA durations of 7 to 10 years, longer in some cases.
Great. I'm going to have one more question. And this is a very interesting one from Benedetta. How do you ensure the energy supplied is actually from renewables if you're considering a hybrid solution and the backup solution is diesel? Can you put penalties when the diesel usage is above your expected?
You can have the seller responsible for providing the fuel to the backup facilities, and that's a very heavy penalty on him.
Yeah.
So not only is he not getting paid for the capacity, the renewable capacity that he should be providing, but he's having to pay as well for the cost of the diesel for the backup generation. You might find that is unduly penalistic, but you've got a set of tools in your armory to deploy, and they need to be deployed in a balanced way so that the incentives on the seller are correct. He might reasonably say, well, there's going to be some degree of backup generation required, or he may have designed the system that it needs a little bit of peak shaving from diesel generation as a least cost arrangement. And he may have built some volume of diesel generation, diesel fuel into his monthly capacity payments.
Great. Look, thanks very much, Robert. I mean, there's more questions there, and I'm really sorry if your question hasn't been responded, but we will ask Robert afterwards, just to see if you can have a quick written response, very sort of high level. But thank you very much, Robert. That's really appreciated.
Pleasure.
Questions.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you.
Brilliant. Excellent. So we're toward the end of today's workshop. So I'd just like to spend a couple of minutes talking about the workshop on Thursday. Amy? So it's at the same time, at 4 o'clock Central European time. And we'd like to kick off with a small presentation from UNICEF. Unfortunately, William is on leave today, so couldn't make today's call, but he wanted to, or we've requested, if it was possible, to give some feedback on their request for information, which they put out at the end of last year on solar solutions. So we've got a few slides from William talking about what they've learned from that process and what it can mean towards sort of leasing and PPA arrangements. But as per the workshop on Workstream 1, today has really been about, exploring what it is we're trying to do, where we want to go with it. And Thursdays is really, capturing your knowledge, your experience into this process. So here, there's 3 breakout groups, and as we did before, we'll send out a quick email to those so that if you have a specific leaning towards a particular breakout session, then you can sign up to it, and we'll make sure you're in the right group. But what we're looking to do is to have one group consider what the ideal RF process would be to ensure we got multiple high quality responses. The second breakout discussion would be looking at the split of services that have to be provided by the vendor and what needs to be provided by the agency itself. For instance, do we have a strong leaning towards the security of the system if it's in a remote area? Who's responsible for that? What about importation? Who takes responsibility for import duties if it comes through the UN and import duties may be non-existent or at least at a lower rate? So that's one of the things that we'd like to look at and get your experience in these processes. And what's been really sort of key that's been talked through the whole process is getting the right people to respond. So the third one really is not so technical, but understanding who do we want to respond to the RfP. And if we have in mind a particular organization or a particular approach to delivering these solutions, what do we need to do to make sure that they are aware of this process and attracted to bidding? So please have a think about that. As I say, we'll send out an email later today or first thing tomorrow, just to align those things. And again, have a think about some of the additional concrete activities that we want to work on. As I sort of said right at the beginning, this really is a process that UNDP is leading on. They would like to sign long-term agreements with energy service companies for power purchase agreements and lease agreements. They want to open up that process as much to their colleagues within the UN system for piggybacking purposes. And as Gregory said, it's about mirroring the ideals and the processes behind that. So please do stick with us if you're interested in doing this, so we'll make sure that your agency considerations are put into that process, and it makes it easier for you to piggyback and easier for UNDP to permit that process to go on. Amy, the next slide. Thank you. So yeah, this is just to remind you, it's at Thursday, and that there is, coming up after this, some work on funding and financing, which is next week. And what we'll be doing there is the session on the Tuesday, we'll be looking at how do we fund the actual workflow process. We have to do upfront work in this before we even get the options out there to tender and proposals. So what are we doing? How do we fund that? And then the one on Thursday is around about financing. How do we, once we got the solution, how do we pay for it? What's the best way forward? We've been talking around about using the cost of price of diesel or the existing cost of, energy, but what are the other options? How do we make it more affordable, more attractive? And where there are uneconomic situations, how do we make those more economic? So that's the sort of workshop series, Amy. So from me, it's, a big thank you. I know this is, a couple of hours of your time where I know most of you are more busy than normal dealing with your day-to-day works from home, but also with the additional work that COVID is bringing to the UN to support. So really thank you for your time in that regard. But I just want to check, is Greg, I know Greg had to drop off very quickly for a call, emergency call. I don't know if he's back in. Doesn't look like it. So unfortunately, no final closing word from Greg, but he will be back on board on Thursday. Just to let you know that Greg is helping the sort of COVID response for UNDP Health, and hence he had to drop off for a quick call there. But Thomas, anything that you'd like to close up as closing words before we depart for the day?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I think I will keep it very short. It's been a long day for all of us, and I think it was a heavy workshop with lots of content. And to me, it shows just how complex this whole situation is. And I think we can reduce the time we all spend on this if we work together. And it's easier to work this through in the group, and that's the beauty of being the UN. We can rely on each other's work, and we can piggyback on the LTAs coming up in this process. So I'm really happy also to see again so many people, so many colleagues online today, even though it's just in inverted commas. The UN colleagues today is a closed shop. So thank you all for coming, for joining again. Yeah, I'm looking forward to Thursday. Over to you, Mark.
Great. As I say, thank you, everyone. We hope you found that very useful and is a good grounding for the conversations that we'll have on Thursday. So thank you. Enjoy your evenings and speak to you all soon. Thank you very much for joining. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.